Welcome to another episode of the Lew Perspective. How are you doing, John?
I'm good, Harold. How are you?
Good, good. You know, we're going to follow up with what we were talking about in a previous episode about the pyramids. And in that episode, we were talking a little bit about the pyramids, but we wanted to dive in a little deeper to think about where, you know, this all started, or kind of get a context.
The culture, the history.
Exactly.
Like, what is what led to this? It's a lot of stuff.
Well, it is.
I will tell you. Just having to research it, I don't figure it was the same, right? Like, that's why I've got my phone up here today, because it's got like too much.
You started to peel back this, and then you realize that, okay, in peeling that back, you found something else that tied into this.
Right.
And so I found myself really immersing myself deeper, and the deeper I went, the deeper it went.
The rabbit hole, down the rabbit hole.
Unbelievable.
Right? It's crazy. But I get why, like, you have people, they're called just Egyptologists.
Yes, I could see how that would be.
Because it's just, you need somebody that knows.
Well, even some of the influences of it, the architecture that we haven't even talked about the architecture, even though when we think about the pyramids, that is part of the architectural context to the Egyptian culture.
Yeah.
But I started to think, okay, where and how did this all start? Where did it start from? And what I found is that there were no really written contexts before 3300 BC.
Okay.
And that what they could speculate on and how they were doing this is they were looking at the tools and the pottery that came from that to try to put together and make assumptions about what the people were before the civilization actually started to come into focus. And so there were these groups that were like nomads. They were sort of gatherers, what they considered gatherers. That's what they did on the land before they started to settle into the Nile Valley.
Yeah.
And the reason they started to settle into the Nile Valley is they found it to be fertile, and they could grow. Things were growing there, and they started to realize that the aspect of them to survive in this area was a lot greater. Right. So it was really kind of like, whoa. So, I wanted to know more about what was happening before and how did this civilization start to come about. And it seemed that there were several different groups of people in the Nile Valley area that started to make up the pretext of the prehistoric aspect of Egypt.
Right.
And so I don't know, what did you find anything in this?
Yeah, so I took notes here. There's so many different eras of Egypt, right? So it's the pre-dynastic Egypt is what you were talking about.
Correct.
Where they were hunter-gatherers. It said that around 6000 BC, I think the weather or the climate started to change so that the Nile became more fertile. And instead of having to be
now, you
nomadic.
said 6,000 BC.
6,000 BC.
So now, when you wrap your mind around 6,000 BC, how long ago was that from current time?
From here, so 6,000 years would be from 6,000 to 0, right?
And then you add
another 2,000, almost 2,000.
So you're talking about 8,025 years. 8,000?
Yeah.
8,000?
Almost 8,000, right?
Yes.
2,000. No, over 2. Yeah, we're in 20.
Right.
Yeah, we're in 2000. Oh my gosh, crazy. 8,000 years.
If you're talking about 6,000.
So 6,000 BC.
When was modern man?
I don't know.
See, that's
I didn't even look at that piece.
Okay, so see, that's where you start to dig here and you dig there, and you realize, okay, So what else did you find?
So that piece was 6,000 years ago, and then they started to cultivate through the Nile Valley, like you were saying. Okay. They developed upper and lower, and it looks like they developed independently.
Yes.
So upper was doing their thing. Yeah, the northern was doing their, or the lower was doing their thing, right? So this was before that they had the dynasties that we kind of know what dynasties are. Right. From Egypt, doing the regular history of Egypt. That's what we know of, is like, hey, there's a dynasty here when you talk of, King Tut and Ptolemy and Cleopatra and all the, those famous.
So who started? I remember seeing there was a king or pharaoh that started the dynasty.
It says it was King, and I think I pronounced it Menes.
Yeah,
Menes.
I couldn't pronounce his name. Yes,
Menes or Menes.
He started
Menes.
the first
3150-ish BC is when it started.
Right. Okay.
I guess he'd be the one that would kind of unify.
Yes,
kind of, we
he
always talk
started
about
to unify the northern and the southern part of the Nile Valley in Egypt,
and that was the start of the dynasty, the dynastic period, first dynastic period for Egypt. But man, it's I mean, that just in that is a lot.
Well, I heard a lot of there were a disbursement of different kingdoms along that area at that time, and that they said that there were a lot of battles and wars that were happening in between that, as they were starting to unify.
Right.
And so you're talking about between the first dynasty and the fourth dynasty, it sounded like there was, maybe the disagreements and things that happened, along that way. And I guess when you think about it, how many years between the the first dynasty and the fourth dynasty? And you think, well, was it like 1,000 years?
Did you have that? I didn't remember writing.
I was trying to remember what the first dynasty. The first dynasty was in 33.
33. Let's see. First ruling dynasty unified in this case. So it set the stage for what's called the Old Kingdom.
Okay.
From 27 to 2200 BC, and then in the third dynasty, that's when you're talking about the pyramids of Giza, which we know today, right? When people say pyramids of Egypt, they think of the pyramids in Giza.
Right. Exactly.
So the third dynasty, that's what you're saying. Or sorry,
it's a fourth dynasty.
But it led into the so
yeah, they were trying to combine the third, fourth, and the fifth, I believe it was. And what was interesting is that I found, and I'm thinking that's probably close to, and I was trying to look at it from 3300 to 27 to 2200 BC. 33 to 22, that's almost 1,000 years, almost in between that time. Between the first dynasty and the fourth dynasty.
Yes, exactly.
So you had like all these tribes or these different civilizations along here combining.
Yep.
And so what was happening is that you started to see what I could kind of put together is that a collective aspect of the technology and the learning and the agriculture was starting to happen after the 31st BC, 3100 BC or 30. They were starting to create these societies that were starting to form as opposed to what was happening before.
Yep.
And so by the time they got to the fourth dynasty, they were saying that this aspect is where the pyramids started to come into place, especially the Giza. Right.
Yeah.
And so they were saying that this was the golden age.
The golden age is what they called it,
Yeah, and so in that they were saying there was peace and prosperity that was happening in this time frame, which was the fourth dynasty lasted about 115 years, I believe it was. And in that time frame, you start to think about the pyramids again. How long did it take to build those pyramids?
Yeah.
So if they started that in the fourth dynasty, the pyramids that we see when we think about the pyramids, we see the pyramids of Giza, and we think, so did it take 100 years to build that? Now I've seen things where they said that it's taken, but to me it still boggles my mind when I think about 100 years to build these structures, and then the complexity of these structures. But they were saying that along the Nile, all of these different civilizations that were combining now are starting to combine their technology, their knowledge of their writing. And it was not until after the first century, it was during the first century they started to document, because there was no documentation prior to that of the Egyptian knowledge. And so that's how they were trying to put together all the tools that they used in that time frame, and pottery that was created to try to understand a little bit more about the pre-existing of the Egyptian startup, the culture that was starting there. So there were times that, and I don't know if you found this, the Bronze Age Did you find anything about that? Yeah, I saw
What did
that.
you have on that?
I found that during that time, it was called the. It became what was called the Bronze. I think the Bronze Age, and I'm taking it that, and I want to dive a little deeper to understand what the bronze, because I'm taking it that maybe they found ways to use metal or to construct these, tools that were
Yeah, that makes
used.
sense.
So I still have yet to dig a little deeper. I started trying to dig deeper into that. So maybe on another
Yeah,
episode
we'll talk about it later.
we'll do that. So,
Yeah,
in any
crazy.
case, what else did you find out?
So I also saw, well, what I have written down and typed out here is that the prosperity for the third and the fourth dynasties is what we talked about, right? Like they were doing really well. The golden era, the golden age, where they had all these big projects. I'm sure the land was fertile. They were able to feed everyone. Prosperity, yeah, everyone was doing just fine and doing great. But I also wanted to touch on kind of, the reason for the pyramids, right? We talk about just culturally, why did they do this? Well, we got to talk about the history of it. But what did they think of a pharaoh, right? Because why would they build this for one person? Like, what it would be? So what I had down, they're somewhere in between, like what the Egyptian society believed their pharaoh was somewhere between a human and divine. They were chosen by the gods, right, to serve as their mediators on earth.
Okay.
So they were sent from heaven, or wherever, whatever the religion was, they were sent from there, and they were a representation of the gods. So they were divine. They looked at them like a supernatural deity, saying you were meant to be here because you were sent from, whoever the kings were, or the gods were. So they had to have everything intact for their pharaoh in the afterlife, as well.
Yes. Okay.
And that's kind of the thought of where these pyramids came from. So
do you think they were supposed to have been larger than life? The reason why these structures were a bit, because I sort of got that sort of impression that this complex, or that this structure was such that it represented the magnitude of what this kingdom, king was.
Yeah, the king was what the pharaoh was. And then it says that they would, the pharaoh was believed to become Osiris, the god of the dead.
Okay.
In the afterlife. So, and then the new pharaoh would become Horus, which is the falcon-like god who served as a protector of the sun god Ra.
Okay.
So the new pharaoh, right? Pharaoh just passed. He becomes Osiris, god of the dead. New pharaoh crowned. He is now Horus, who is a protector of the sun god Ra.
Okay.
So it had very religious.
Yeah, they had some really
connotations and background for this too, as well, right? So just interesting to think of that piece as well.
It would have been really interesting to know more too of what was the first, because they did a lot of hieroglyph, and carvings and things that sort of told the story and created the language so that we start to understand. I saw a piece that was on early Egyptian language, and it said it dated to the point, and it was no longer used, but it was a language that was sort of Afro something that was a combination, and I thought. And I saw the text of it. They had an image of it, but it was really detailed looking.
Right.
To think early on where they start to create the language, even some of the language. I mean, you think about the English language today, we speak, but we don't necessarily think about the, where it came from.
Right.
And so you think back in BC, 3300 BC.
Yeah, 3250. I just pull it up real quick. 3250 to 400 AD is when Egyptian hieroglyphics were used. So you're talking a span of almost 4,000 years, 3,600 years
ago, right?
Yep, exactly. Which is crazy.
Well, no, that's the part where when we started to dig, the more you dug,
Yeah.
the deeper you found yourself,
The more little
start
branches
to
you can
bring,
shoot
yes,
off to,
right,
because you could talk about hieroglyphics
just
in and
by
of
itself. Yes.
and then we could do religion. Right? We could do religion,
Well,
hieroglyphs.
see,
We
that was
could
kind
do
of
like,
interesting
oh
because
my goodness.
I started trying to see, okay, in this time frame,
Yeah.
how did the religious figures in the Bible, how were they intertwined with this moment? Because when Jesus was born, they really didn't. And I started to branch off into that, trying to understand, because BC was the starting or the ending point of the aspect of what was happening in Egypt
Yep.
at the beginning of when Christ was born, but they didn't have any specific year of which Christ was born, but they speculated it was about somewhere between, I thought it said 3 or 4 BC,
Right.
that where they said, but if you remember in that Herod was the king at that time, and he ordered to make sure, because he knew that this new king was coming, and he wanted to make certain that this new king was not going to come and rule and overrule him. So he ordered I think every kid that was from 0 to 2 or something like that,
I don't remember.
to be exterminated.
Slaughtered. Yeah, slaughtered.
Yes, and they set out to do that. But
Was that the one where unless you had to put like the blood on the? Was that different?
That was different because that right
Which
there.
one was that?
Remember, I was talking about that was
that
like
the
in
plague?
Moses.
That was the plague.
Yes, that was in Moses'
Okay,
time. That's what I was trying to understand. But that was, you said that, wasn't it like around 13 something when Moses?
Yes, that's what they're saying. A figure like Moses was around the 1300s.
And that was happening in Egypt at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's why I was trying to tie in, because those aspects of it, because the Nile was part of what was in the Old Testament. It was talked about how these plagues were happening in Egypt and the effect on this people. And just like we were talking about putting the blood of the lamb over the door, that stopped that displayed the fact that the firstborn in that household would not be taken away
like a lamb.
Yes, because it was what Egypt had sacrificed and sent out. So that was sort of happening. And that's what I was trying to understand, the location time frame of when Jesus was born. And so in that, you had, think about it, you had Sudan, which I believe Egypt ruled the northern part of Sudan. But the southern part, it didn't rule over that. So to me, what were those people like over in the southern part of Sudan versus the northern part? And then you had Ethiopia that was ruled underneath the king of Egypt at that time. And so when we think about, everybody's heard about the 3 wise men, but you think about the king from Ethiopia. Here's about this celestial event that's happening around this area just outside of Egypt. Again, all in this area. And that's where you found yourself branching off into that, trying to understand, okay, where is 0? And they said that there is no 0 year.
Okay.
That it started from the moment that somewhere between 3 and 4 BC. Then AD came, because the birth of Christ was the one that changed that existing time frame. And AD came in at the moment of his birth, but they couldn't definitively say what year that was. Because if you think, Christ was moved out of the way where all the other kids were, so they didn't really have a definitive time frame. And even when I started to look to see, okay, when did it say that this was existing in that Egypt time frame, they really didn't have and even it says the Bible didn't have a set date, time that it said that when Christ was born, whether it was in the spring or whether it was in the winter. Some speculated it was in September. Some said it was in the spring of that year, like somewhere around April or so. And I found myself trying to see, okay, was there any connections in between the 30 BC to 313 AD? Now, in that time, the reason I mentioned that is because in that time frame, it seemed that Rome had moved into Egypt. Did you have anything on that? Because I remember,
the Romans,
the Romans,
we talked. I think we talked
their
about
aspect.
Oh yeah, they went in and was it the Ptolemaic, I think,
It was in
period,
that
something
time.
like that. Yeah,
Okay.
where
And that
they
was around
ruled
30
30
BC.
BC to
Okay.
and then it went to the 8600 or something like that AD.
Okay. Okay.
So it was quite some time, right? I mean, it's
They were there for
700 years almost.
Yeah. So they were
So-
there during the time that Christ was in the area there. Okay.
Yeah,
So that it's to me then that sort of frames up what the Bible talks about in the time that Christ was here, and then the effect of that area right there. And it didn't really say anything about Christ being in Egypt per se, but there were the men, the king from Ethiopia that traveled to what he was told was going to be this location for the birth of this new king that was coming.
okay.
And Herod was afraid, if you think in Egypt, of that. So it kind of starts to go down that pathway as well.
Right.
And you think about the effects on Egyptian culture, the life, and how they were navigating through that time. And so it was really interesting to start peeling back that to really get a glimpse of it. And you think about the time frame.
Yeah. It's amazing.
I'm still
amazing, yeah.
standing here, and the more I dug,
So I also have that ancient Egyptians, they believe when the king died, part of his spirit, which is known as Ka, remained in the body. So
did it say anything about that?
To properly care for the spirits, right? The corpse was mummified, and everything that the king would need in the afterlife was buried with the king or the pharaoh. So that's gold. It could be food, furniture, any other.
I think we talked about that. So that was the reason. Okay. So did you have any more detail on that?
They became, so it says pyramids became the focus of a cult of the dead king that was supposed to continue well after his life. So riches would provide not only him, but also the relatives, the officials, the priests who buried who were buried near him as well. So it was for.
Were they also in the tomb of the pyramids?
Near here.
Near that.
So yeah, I'm sure family was right. If I remember, wasn't family like?
Well, I was wondering if they were in a different chamber or something like that.
Right? Like he had the main chamber, and then there were shoot offs of the other chambers that they had.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean that was kind of the point of it, was really for afterlife.
That's what they were.
Religious. Drove them to do this.
I found where they said they called it cults.
Yes,
and they said that it wasn't defined in the
not like what we think of
as a cult. It was their divine spiritual sort of context and what the people were worshiping at that time.
Right. Yeah. Not what we think of as like, oh, it's all hail.
Right.
Like, yes, it kind of was, right? Because it's all for this one person.
Right.
But I think the whole thing was like, it's for that one, but we still have, like, there was another one that came, right? Another pharaoh that came right after.
Yes.
Right? It's not like they said, oh, we can only do, so... Yeah.
Well, what's kind of interesting, too, is that while looking at this, and I think you and we were talking about this, everybody's heard of the King Tut. And so I was trying to understand in the context of when you talk about the first dynasty, and you said, where did he come in context to the, and I'm going to say he came in, it seemed like it was around the middle part, which was about the 18th century.
Yeah, he was the 18th dynasty.
The 18th dynasty.
1341 BC to 1323 BC.
Okay.
Is when he ruled.
He only ruled for like about 9 years, it said.
Yeah, he was only about 18, 19 when he passed away.
Yeah, and what I found, it was like, it didn't really say how. It just said mysterious circumstances.
Unexpectedly passed away or died. That's what this says, yeah. So,
But that dynasty stayed around for like, I thought it was like 257 years, I thought.
Yeah, I don't have the exact timing on it. Do you have the timing on that?
Yeah, it said the 18th dynasty was around for 257 years.
This was a long time.
So if you think about it, the dynasty was around the 1500s BC.
So he was in there.
And he was in there, but he was like, it looks like around 13, it showed him to be around 1332, and he ruled to 1323.
Yeah, 10 years after, or 9 years after.
9 years, yes.
And
then he was gone, but he took over when he was 9 years old.
Right.
And so I don't know.
So we can talk about all that too, because
that's a whole
nother subject too.
Yes, and that's how we started to peel that back, and you started. Wait a minute,
you had
but everybody knew
children that were pharaohs. A 9-year-old's not running a nation or a country, or
Right. Well, I mean, you think about that. How would they know what's going on?
Yeah, they don't know.
But he was in place, and everything or whatever they said was
law.
The law.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, who took over after him?
After Tut?
Yes.
I don't know.
See, because if he had died unexpectedly, there had to be someone. I'm speculating that if you got family members, and you think about how long that dynasty had been in place before him, and then for him to all of a sudden be relegated as the king.
Yep.
In that time period, you had to think, well, maybe there were family members that were in there that thought he shouldn't be, even though he was in place to take the throne, and he was relegated to that.
Yep.
They thought, well, he doesn't know what he's doing, and so on and so forth. And so they plan his demise.
So it says this, and the name is A-Y, so I don't know if it's pronounced I or...
Okay.
He was the pharaoh that
preceded
Tut. But
preceded or post?
He succeeded.
Succeeded, okay.
But they're saying that he was a close advisor to 2, perhaps 3 other pharaohs of the dynasty. So I imagine he's fairly old.
Okay.
Right? He was already helping to guide other pharaohs, and they're saying that he potentially was the power behind the throne of King Tut.
So he was sort of advising.
He was the one that was making the moves and just saying,
telling the king
is it off.
Okay.
Give me that little, that your hieroglyph or something.
I mean, hypothetically, and you'd almost think that, and they've not known. I mean, we could hear and assume, and I'm just trying to make some assumptions of it. So, if he was in power for from 9 to 18, or 19, they were saying 18 or 19, somewhere in that proximity. That's when his demise was. So, if he was in that space and time, and this individual was sort of guiding him, his advisor, and so on, then who would upthrone him? Because the dynasty didn't end in his demise.
Yep.
It continued. So I wonder who was the one that took over after him to oversee the throne. And more than likely, I mean, it could be a very good movie that you did something like that, and you showed that it was a family member that was scheming on taking over the space, kind of like Dallas.
The show Dallas.
The show Dallas.
They rebooted that one too, by the way. Did you see that?
Something about that.
A while back. Anyway. So after then it was Horemheb, it looks like. So he was the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty.
So I wonder where did he come in the family?
Let's see. I can't. Man, this history thing.
Because I mean, if you had Tut come in,
and they said I was perhaps the grandson-in-law, or he was the great uncle of Tut. So he was very old.
Okay,
he was very old. And then this Horemheb.
Okay.
He was the last pharaoh. So he ruled from 15. Well, he was alive from. Sorry, the 18th dynasty was from 1550 to 1292.
Correct.
So he ruled for 14 years.
After Tut.
After I. Oh. I was 4 years.
Okay.
And then he was just old, right?
Okay.
So he was really old.
So he took over after Tut.
Yeah, he took over after Tut.
So for the next 4 years,
the pharaoh.
Right after that.
And then
do you think that he may have had something to do with
Tut? But he was so old too, right? So I don't know. But you never maybe he wanted his time in the spotlight.
Yeah, but if you think about it, I mean, that's what I'm thinking. I'm saying,
in the spotlight.
Because they said mysterious.
Yeah, I've been doing this for I've had 3-4 pharaohs already that I'm doing this.
Well, he was doing it during all the time that Tut was in place.
Yeah.
So he was thinking, why is this kid right here in the place when I could be doing it?
Yeah. Why don't I get my name up there?
Well, that's what I'm kind of
wondering. Why don't I get that pyramid?
Because they didn't, and think about it. Okay, if you were in control of this, you would not have it be anything that's documented. Anybody that tried to document it, you would have them removed.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Tell my history.
Yeah, it's well. Look, I'm controlling the country,
history,
right?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not going to be written about it, and he's just going to fade away. Maybe he drank something that didn't agree with him,
right?
And then we're going to mummify him, and we're going to lift him up as the king, the youngest, because he shouldn't be in power,
right? Yeah.
And I'm still part of the family, so I'm part of that.
Conspiracy theories, man.
Of course it is. I mean, but I'm just saying because they had that mysterious circumstances, and King Tut became sort of iconic.
Yeah.
With the pyramids.
Well, yeah, that and the discovery with all the gold and everything like that.
Course.
I mean, that was back when I was growing up. That was a big thing. And then they used to tour his.
Well, they even made that song. That song, King Tut.
I don't know that song.
You didn't hear it. Yeah, there was a song that was out about King Tut.
I don't know that one.
Anyway.
Oh my goodness.
In our next episode, I guess we'll continue.
I mean, I know we kind of got how many tangents did we get off on today? I mean, that was like so many.
They all kind of coincided to
they all intersect.
Yes, and to
but you can go off of so many.
Well, I mean, there's so many to go off of. Yeah. I mean, when you think about the structure of the Egyptian culture and the civilization, I'm still curious as to how that's dispersed out to other potential civilizations that started around the world.
Right.
You talk about the Roman Empire, and when you think about the length of what the Egyptian dynasty was, and you think the Roman Empire was not anywhere near as long as the Egyptian. So then what about when you look across on the other side of the world and you start talking about the Mayan and Aztecs and so on, those civilizations.
What about the Chinese?
Well, then yes, absolutely. You start talking about that.
You talk about dynasties too.
So that's why I was trying to understand, are there any correlations that spread out from this point that Egypt may have had some influence on?
Yeah.
In any case, on our next time, we'll see if we can find a little bit more about it. And if anyone knows anything, we'd love to.
We have so much to talk about. I know we were trying to get to the pyramids, but we talked about all the history.
Well, we talked about because you started to understand the pyramids and why and so on. So we started out with the pyramids, but then we wanted to understand more why they came about.
Why? And then I think we'll start exploring also just how.
I mean, if we really wanted to take a leap out, we say, well, they were influenced by aliens from another place.
My goodness, here we go.
So on our next time, we'll see what else we can find out about Egyptians. Thank you for joining us today here.
Yeah, follow us.
Yes, we're going to say that do a act of kindness. Yes,
kindness is free.
We always like to implement that out and say, reach out to you and ask you to do an act of kindness here. We definitely need to have that. In this day and age,
especially now, right? That's what it is.
Until next time,
follow us. Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. I'm missing one.
Are you
TikTok?
Oh, you did. That one almost got away.
I came up here.
We'll see you next time.
Bye. Thanks.